What if I told you Hitler built a gun so powerful it could hit London from deep inside France without ever moving an inch? This isn't alternate history. This is the V-3 Supergun, Nazi Germany's real-life mega-weapon developed in 1943. Its official name was the Hochdruckpumpe high-pressure pump, but in practice, it was a fixed artillery monstrosity buried in a hillside fortress, designed to fire hundreds of explosive shells a day across the English Channel. Its barrel stretched longer than the Eiffel Tower is tall. Its purpose to obliterate London one shell at a time. And yet, it never fired a single round in combat. Not one. Built at enormous cost, buried underground, and guarded by Hitler's personal obsession. The V-3 was meant to be the Reich's ultimate revenge for the Blitz. But what happened instead is a story of flawed physics, collapsing tunnels, and a British bombing run so precise, it buried the weapon before it ever got the chance to scream. This video will reveal how Nazi Germany nearly changed the shape of warfare with a supergun, and why the world should be thankful it failed. It was late 1943. Nazi Germany was bleeding on every front. The Red Army had shattered Hitler's eastern ambitions at Stalingrad. The Allies had invaded Italy and were tightening the noose from the south and from above. British and American bombers were reducing German cities to ashes. The Reich was in retreat. Its promises of a 1,000-year empire reduced to frantic scrambles for salvation. In this atmosphere of desperation, Hitler clung to the idea of Wunderwaffe wonder weapons that could reverse the tide. Rockets, jet aircraft, super tanks, anything that could deliver a psychological or strategic blow. And into this fever dream stepped August Kunders, an engineer working for Rheinmetall Borsig. Kunders had an idea straight out of science fiction, a fixed-position artillery cannon capable of firing shells over 100 miles far enough to reach London from northern France. But this wasn't a normal gun. His design used multiple propellant charges spaced along the barrel, firing in sequence as the shell moved forward. This multi-charge method, in theory, would accelerate the shell gradually, reducing stress on the barrel and increasing range dramatically. The concept was pitched to the Wehrmacht High Command, and then to Hitler himself. And Hitler loved it. He approved immediate construction at Mimoyek, a chalky hillside in northern France. Engineers began carving out tunnels, installing rails, and planning a massive underground fortress. The V-3, as it was designated, would have multiple barrels, each over 400 feet long, buried at a shallow angle, aimed squarely at London. Hitler imagined it as a vengeance cannon, one that would punish the British for Dresden, for Hamburg, for every night the Reich had burned under Allied bombs. Unlike the V-1 buzz bomb or the V-2 rocket, which were expensive and complex, the V-3 could be mass-produced, operated remotely, and hidden underground. It was the ultimate long-range artillery platform on paper. But they overlooked one fatal problem: physics doesn't care about paper. And concrete doesn't cure faster than bombs can fall. The V-3 wasn't just another big gun. It was a leap into the absurd. Imagine a cannon embedded in a hillside, its barrel longer than a football field, firing shells at nearly 1 to 500 meters per second, all powered by a series of side-mounted explosive charges. This wasn't conventional artillery. It was a monstrosity powered by staggered detonations, designed to accelerate a shell continuously as it traveled down a 400-foot barrel. The core design was deceptively simple. Instead of one massive charge at the base of the gun, the V-3 used a sequence of smaller charges placed along the barrel in angled side chambers. As the shell passed each chamber, it would trigger an ignition, giving it a fresh push forward. Theoretically, this would allow a smaller, lighter projectile to reach incredible velocities enough to strike London from over 100 miles away. The design called for multiple barrels, built at a fixed 50-degree angle mounted into the hill at Mimoyekis. The expected rate of fire, 10 shells per minute per barrel. Hitler wanted 5 barrels operational, meaning London could face up to 600 shells per hour. Compared to standard German artillery, the V-3 promised 5 times the range and 20 times the fire rate. It sounded like the perfect weapon for strategic terror. But then came the catch. The shells were small, too small. Because they had to travel such extreme distances, they couldn't carry large explosive payloads. Each one packed only a few pounds of high explosives, far less than a conventional bomb or even a V-1 rocket. The plan was quantity over quality overwhelm London with dozens of tiny impacts per hour. That also meant no precision, no targeting, just blind saturation fire on the city. And the technology behind the staggered charges experimental at best. Timing had to be perfect. If a single charge ignited too soon or too late, the shell could wobble, lose speed, or worse, explode inside the barrel. Twist number 1. On paper, the V-3 was the ultimate artillery piece. In reality, it was a physics nightmare waiting to blow itself apart. The design was ambitious, massive, and completely out of touch with battlefield reality. But that didn't stop Hitler. Orders were given, concrete was poured, and Mimoyek's fortress began to take shape. Building the V-3 wasn't just a challenge, it was a full-blown engineering war against the clock, the terrain, and Allied intelligence. The chosen site, Mimoyeks, France, a hillside fortress just 100 miles from London, selected for its elevation, chalky soil, and proximity to the English Channel. But what looked good on a topographical map quickly became a nightmare underground. Construction began in late 1943 under the direction of the organization TOT, the Nazi engineering corps responsible for Germany's fortifications. Thousands of laborers, including conscripted workers and POWs, were forced into brutal conditions to excavate massive tunnels. These weren't just gun barrels, they were entire underground cities. Each gun required a 130-meter sloped shaft, plus side chambers, loading areas, supply tunnels, and protective bunkers. The V-3 complex was supposed to hold 5 fully operational barrels, all angled to fire on London. Each shaft had to be reinforced with concrete, lined with rails, and connected to ammunition elevators. It was a marvel of construction, but also a massive target. The Allies knew something was happening. Aerial reconnaissance photos showed strange construction patterns at Mimoyeks. Intelligence reports spoke of a new type of long-range gun, and Britain wasn't going to sit around and wait for the first shell to land. Then came the tall boys. In July 1944, the Royal Air Force launched a series of raids using the new 12,000-pound tall boy deep penetration bombs designed by Barnes-Wallis, the genius behind the bouncing bomb. These massive bombs didn't explode on impact. They drilled deep into the earth before detonating, sending shock waves that shattered underground structures. And they worked. One tall boy punched straight through the reinforced roof of the Mimoyeks site, collapsed an entire barrel shaft, and buried key tunnels in rubble. Other bombs triggered cave-ins and destroyed entrances. The V-3 installation was rendered inoperable before it ever came online. Leadership still tried to keep hope alive. Hitler reportedly told aides, "This gun will make London scream every hour." But reality had already spoken with 1,000 pounds of TNT and a mountain of collapsed concrete. The V-3's greatest strength, its underground secrecy, became its tomb. Final fatal detail, the barrels were so long and so rigid, they couldn't be adjusted or realigned after the bombings. They cracked under the stress, bent slightly out of shape. Even a 1-degree misalignment would send shells into the sea or the countryside. The Supergun was entombed in its own fortress. While the main V-3 installation at Mimoyeks was under construction, the Germans established a separate testing site at Misdroy, a remote area on the Baltic coast in modern-day Poland. It was here, far from Allied bombers, that the Supergun would be fired in secret. The goal proved that the progressive charge system could launch a shell over 100 miles with enough velocity and stability to hit London. Expectations were sky high. The Nazi command expected to see terrifying results, long-range strikes with mechanical precision and overwhelming volume. The engineers envisioned the test shells soaring across the coastline, crashing into the sea with devastating impact. Reality was far less dramatic. When the first rounds were fired, the entire test facility shook, but the shells barely reached 55 miles. Some veered off course. Others tumbled mid-flight. The progressive charge concept, while revolutionary, couldn't deliver consistent power. The ignition timing of the side charges had to be near perfect, but the primitive electronics and mechanical delays introduced just enough margin of error to throw everything off. A delay of just milliseconds between charges could destabilize the shell or rupture the barrel. One officer described the scene. It shook the ground, but not the enemy. Another recalled, the shells screamed into the sky and landed nowhere near the target. Worst of all was the payload. Each shell, built for long-range speed, could carry only a few pounds of explosives. The destructive power was closer to a mortar round than a strategic bomb. Even if the V-3 had managed to bombard London, the actual damage would have been symbolic cracks in walls, broken windows. Perhaps some civilian casualties, but nothing close to the devastation of a V-2 rocket. Still, Hitler's inner circle demanded fixes. Patch-up attempt 1 redesigning the shells to carry more explosives, but this made them heavier, reducing range and increasing stress on the barrel. Patch-up 2 boosting the pressure of the propellant charges, but this caused 2 test barrels to rupture under the strain. Patch-up 3 shortening the barrel length to reduce failure points, but this killed the entire purpose, reducing range and accuracy to below conventional artillery standards. Nothing worked. The test results were buried in reports stamped secret, and the engineers grew increasingly desperate. Meanwhile, the Allied air raids on France intensified. Time was running out. And the worst part, after all that testing, all that effort, and all that money, the V-3 still hadn't fired a single shell at its intended target. Not one. For all its massive scale and bold ambition, the V-3 Supergun was ultimately undone by basic physics and bad assumptions. The idea of firing a shell over 100 miles using multiple side charges sounded elegant in theory, but in practice, it was a mechanical and thermodynamic nightmare. The problem lay in timing and energy dispersion. Each side-mounted charge had to ignite precisely as the shell passed by, giving it a clean boost forward. But ignition lag, heat buildup, and imperfect pressure waves made this nearly impossible. Instead of gaining steady acceleration, the shell often lost stability or gained it unevenly. The result, unpredictable trajectories, velocity fluctuations, and dangerous stress on the barrel. And then there was the friction. The longer the barrel, the more the shell had to endure contact with the rifled interior. This increased heat, resistance, and deformation. The gun was trying to do too much with too little control. Compared to the German V-2 rocket, the V-3 looked primitive. The V-2 used gyroscopic guidance and liquid-fueled propulsion, delivering a 2,000-pound warhead at supersonic speeds. It hit targets, it created craters, it terrified cities. The V-3, it was big, fixed in place, slow to reload, and delivered a glorified grenade. An internal SS engineering report, circulated after the Mistroy test failures, quietly advised abandoning the project. It labeled the system operationally unsuitable under combat conditions and warned of systemic mechanical instabilities that cannot be corrected under current technological constraints. But the V-3's real failure wasn't just technical. It was strategic. This was a fixed weapon, immobile, inflexible, and vulnerable to airstrikes. In a war dominated by movement, speed, and air power, the V-3 was a World War I idea repackaged with 1940s steel and hubris. The lesson was painfully clear. Bigger isn't better, it's just louder when it collapses. By July 1944, the dream of the V-3 Supergun was already crumbling, literally. After the devastating RAF Tallboy raids on Mimoyeke, the weapon's underground chambers were buried under tons of collapsed chalk and reinforced concrete. The shafts cracked, the barrels buckled, and the firing galleries filled with rubble and silence. Hitler's Supergun was dead before it ever spoke. The project was officially abandoned later that year. No public announcement, no ceremony. just a quiet cancellation buried in bureaucratic reports. The Allies would later discover the site in full, stunned by its scale and ambition, but amused by the result, a weapon so over-engineered, it never fired a single operational shot. August Kunders, the gun's lead designer, escaped the post-war tribunals. He wasn't charged with war crimes, and after the fall of the Third Reich, he quietly returned to civilian engineering. His Supergun, once hailed as a game-changer, became little more than a strange footnote in military textbooks. The cost estimates vary, but when adjusted for modern inflation, Germany likely spent over 100 million USD on the V-3 program. That included tunneling, labor, materials, failed prototypes, testing facilities, and ammunition development, all for a weapon that achieved zero combat use. And here's the final twist: Hitler never got to see the V-3 fire. Despite his personal obsession with the weapon and constant status updates from the front, he died without hearing a single test shot from his London cannon. Not one shell ever screamed out of Mimoyex toward Britain. So let's do the final tally: 5 barrels planned, 1 mile of sloped gun chambers, 10,000 workers, 2 years of effort, and over $100 million in resources. Result: 0 shells fired, and 1 fortress turned into a concrete tomb. The V-3 Supergun may have failed as a weapon, but its audacity left a curious imprint on the future of military technology. Though buried before it ever fired, the concept of progressive charge propulsion fascinated post-war scientists and engineers across the globe. After 1945, Allied investigators scoured German weapons sites, including Mimoyeckes and Misdroy. They collected V-3 schematics, barrel fragments, and ignition systems. The gun's fundamental principle, sequential acceleration through multiple explosive charges, was deemed too unstable for battlefield use, but it planted a seed. In the Cold War years, American and Soviet engineers began experimenting with staged propulsion systems and electromagnetic acceleration concepts. The V-3's ghost echoed in early railgun prototypes and long-range kinetic energy weapons. Even NASA studied the idea. The concept of using sequential energy bursts to launch a small payload at extreme velocities found its way into theoretical models for space gun launches, devices intended to fire satellites into orbit without rockets. The V-3 also served as a sobering lesson for military planners that fixed-position megaweapons are liabilities in the age of air superiority. Its failure reinforced the shift toward mobile, flexible, and precision-guided systems. By the 1960s, militaries worldwide favored missile silos, not hillside cannons. So what can modern innovators learn from this monstrous gun that never fired? First, complexity without control is chaos. The V-3 relied on perfect timing between dozens of charges, something 1940s technology simply couldn't guarantee. Second, if your weapon can't move, it's already obsolete. Fixed fortresses and mega-artillery were relics by the time the first tall boy landed. Third, bold ideas don't make good strategy. Innovation has to serve the war you're fighting, not the one you fantasize about. In the end, the V-3 failed not because it wasn't clever, but because it belonged to the wrong era. It was a 19th century siege gun wrapped in 20th century ambition. And like so many of Hitler's Wunderwaffe, it proved that obsession is no substitute for strategy. What if the V-3 Supergun had worked? Picture it, summer 1944. As Allied forces prepare for the invasion of Normandy, hundreds of shells begin raining down on London hour after hour, day after day. Each one small, but relentless. Psychological warfare. Not with explosions, but with exhaustion. A population worn thin. Bomb shelters reopened. Troop deployments delayed. If just one of Mimoyek's 5 barrels had gone operational, it could have launched up to 600 shells per hour toward the British capital. Even with minimal payloads, the sheer volume might have disrupted logistics, diverted resources, and fractured morale. But here's the truth: even in success, the damage would have been symbolic. Unlike the V-2 rocket, which struck like a thunderclap, the V-3's small warheads lacked shock and awe. Its real power was fear, and perhaps the greatest luck of all was that it failed before imitation. If the Allies or the Soviets had copied the design, the Cold War might have opened with hillside cannons firing into cities instead of diplomacy behind closed doors. In the end, physics saved London, and the world dodged a future filled with underground giants. And this is only failure number 4 in our countdown of Nazi mega-weapons that never lived up to their nightmares. A mile-long barrel, a fortress buried in chalk, over $100 million and 2 years of digging, all for a gun that never fired. This was the story of the V-3 Supergun, Nazi Germany's last, loudest, and most laughable attempt to terrorize London from a distance, bigger than any cannon in history, but beaten not by enemy fire, by its own physics and British bombs. If you want more stories like this where ambition outpaces reality, hit that subscribe button. Next up, we're diving into Japan's plan to bomb America using submarines that launched seaplanes. Yes, really. And here's our question for you. What do you think is history's most impractical weapon? Was it the V-3, the Panjandrum, the Tsar tank? Let us know in the comments, because sometimes the most dangerous weapons are the ones that never work.